While everybody was watching the noise, the threats, the posts, the tariff headlines, something much bigger was happening underneath it all. A structural shift, quiet, methodical, irreversible, and most people missed it. Because when Trump escalated his trade war against Canada with fresh tariffs on steel and aluminum, it looked familiar. Another pressure play, another loud move, another attempt to force submission through size, speed, and shock. But while Washington was performing power, Canada was redesigning it. And once you understand that, the whole story changes. This wasn't a tariff dispute anymore. This wasn't a standard trade spat. This was a power reset because Trump thought he was facing opposition. He wasn't. He was facing irrelevance. Let that sink in. The old rule was simple. America is the market. America is the gatekeeper. America is the gravity well. And if Canada depends on access to that market, then Canada eventually folds. That was the assumption. That was the comfort. That was the fatal mistake. Trump's move made sense if you were thinking in old world terms. Hit a smaller partner hard enough, fast enough, publicly enough, and they panic. They complain. They negotiate. They come back asking for terms. Historically, that logic had teeth. The United States buys the majority of Canada's exports. The supply chains are deeply integrated. Parts, metals, energy, food, vehicles, industrial inputs all woven together over decades. On paper, that should have been overwhelming leverage. But here was the fatal assumption. Leverage only works if the other side has no choice. And Canada decided that was the one condition it would no longer accept. So what did Ottawa do? It didn't panic. It didn't rush. It didn't perform outrage as strategy. It waited. Then it answered with tariffs of its own, first on $30 billion worth of U.S. goods, then another $29, $8 billion including steel, aluminum, and a wide band of American products, dollar for dollar. Precise, deliberate, not symbolic, but the real. Counterstrike wasn't the tariff list. It was what came after. They didn't fight inside the system. They stepped outside of it. Think about what that means. If your opponent is trying to squeeze you through dependence, the smartest move is not just retaliation, it's escape. Now here's where it gets uncomfortable because the numbers don't lie. Washington treated Canada like a replaceable partner. It isn't. Not in metals, not in minerals, not in strategic inputs. The United States depends heavily on Canada for aluminum. Canada is the largest foreign source. Not optional aluminum, not easily replaceable aluminum. The U.S. also depends on Canada for nickel, roughly half of American nickel. Needs, according to CSIS, not optional nickel, not easily replaceable nickel. And then there's uranium, where Canada supplies about a quarter of U.S. domestic demand, not optional uranium, not easily replaceable uranium. And that's before you even get to the industrial choreography. Some North American components cross the U.S.-Canada border multiple times during production. Multiple times, one system, one mesh, one giant shared machine, which means when you slap tariffs on Canada, you are not punishing a distant rival. You are taxing your own circulation. That's not leverage anymore. That's exposure. Let that sink in. And once you understand that, Trump's trade war starts to look less like strength and more like self-inflicted vulnerability, because real power is not about who shouts louder. It's about who builds the structure, who builds the route, who builds the alternative, who builds the future so they no longer need permission to move. And this is the part most people still don't fully grasp. Canada didn't just answer Washington. It widened the board. It brought in outside players, serious players, European players, Indo-Pacific players, rule-making players, just days after taking office. Mark Carney went straight to France and Britain, not for ceremony, not for optics, for alignment, for signal, for strategic depth. In Paris, Macron talked about working with more loyal partners. In London, Carney reinforced that Canada had to deal with the world beyond reflexive U.S. dependence. Now pay attention to the speed. Serious. Countries do not move that fast unless they see something bigger than a headline opportunity, a bypass, a vacuum, a chance to build around American volatility. And once you understand that, the meetings start to look very different. No grand spectacle. No theatrical signing ceremony, no staged triumph. In France, there were no journalists. Questions before the talks. In Britain, no joint press conference was expected. No press, no staged announcements, just negotiations, just positioning, just serious people trying to build a post-dependence contingency before the next shock arrives. Then the board expanded even further. By March 2026, Carney was being linked to efforts connecting Europe and the SDP bloc in a broader rules-based trade alignment, one designed not necessarily to eliminate the United States, but to reduce everyone's vulnerability to it. That matters, because when allies start designing trade rules, origin rules, and fallback institutions without waiting for Washington, the issue is no longer trade friction, it's lost centrality. You can't control movement that no longer passes through you. You can't dictate terms to a system that is already rerouting around your pressure. That is what lost relevance looks like in real time, quietly, systematically, and to the untrained eye, almost invisibly. And this is where the story stops being theoretical and starts becoming irreversible. Because Canada didn't just talk about diversification. It funded it. At T-scale. Budget 2025 proposed a C5 billion trade diversification corridors fund over 7 years. Another C5 billion strategic response fund over 6 years, up to C1 billion for regional tariff response, a C10 billion large enterprise tariff loan facility, worker reskilling money, sector support, export expansion, a stated goal to double non-US exports over the next decade. That is not a press cycle, that is a state response. Then in March 2026, Ottawa moved from budget language to implementation. The government formally launched calls for proposals under the C5 billion Trade Diversification Corridors Fund and a separate C1 billion Arctic Infrastructure Fund. The stated goal was to strengthen transportation infrastructure, relieve congestion, improve access to global markets beyond the United States, and bolster Arctic sovereignty and defense readiness. Think about what that means. This is not just trade policy. This is logistics policy, security policy, industrial policy, sovereignty policy. The Trade Diversification Corridors Fund explicitly includes intermodal capacity for non-US markets, even inland ports. The Arctic Fund is tied to defense readiness, northern access, and dual use. Infrastructure and the financing model matters too, a mix of repayable and non-repayable contributions, with collaboration from the Canada Infrastructure Bank to stretch capital and accelerate build-out. Not flashy, not viral, but devastatingly smart. Because once mundane infrastructure gets reclassified as a survival priority, the politics change. A port is no longer just a port. A corridor is no longer just a corridor. An inland logistics hub is no longer just a convenience. It becomes a national security priority. And while that was being built, what was Trump still doing? Arguing, threatening, posting. You can't pressure someone who has already moved on, not emotionally moved on, structurally moved on. That's the part that matters. So what does the new reality actually look like? It looks like separation by pillars. Not dramatic, not cinematic, but systematic. The old model was submission after shock. The new model is measured counterpressure. Canada answered with tariffs on tens of billions of dollars of US goods, then selectively kept steel, aluminum, and auto countermeasures in place even after removing other tariffs. That tells you something important. This wasn't emotional retaliation. It was targeted leverage preservation. The old reliance was obvious. Sell south, depend south, negotiate south. The new approach is slower, harder, and far more durable. Reuters reported that Canada's exports to the US fell to 68% of total exports between May 2024 and May 2025, down 10 percentage points, while exports to the rest of the world rose sharply. The UK replaced China as Canada's second biggest export market for 3 straight months through May. Gold, petroleum, uranium, and pharmaceuticals found stronger flows to allies beyond the US now. Does that mean Canada has escaped US dependence completely? No. And that's exactly why this is more credible. This is not fantasy. This is transition, painful, incomplete, but real. The old dependence was not just about buyers. It was about pathways. If the route runs through someone else's system, they own your risk. That is why Ottawa's corridor strategy matters so much. Core trade corridors, inland, ports, non-US intermodal capacity, reduced congestion, better access to overseas markets, Arctic transport links with dual civilian and defense use. This is how countries convert speeches into options. The old assumption was bilateral dependency. The new method is networked resilience. Carney's outreach to France and Britain was not random, nor was the broader push to connect middle powers across the EU and SPTP sphere. The deeper play is clear. If one gatekeeper becomes erratic, build a wider room, build more doors, build more counterparties, and this is the deepest layer. The old dependency wasn't just trade. It was systems, data, defense, technology. Carney openly said Canada's security relationship was too focused on the United States and launched a review of the F-35 procurement, partly because Ottawa needed to diversify. Reuters noted that allies depend on U.S. systems not just for hardware, but for target identification, data processing, and operational support. That is, not a procurement issue, that is infrastructure of sovereignty. Put those 5 pillars together and what do you get? You don't just get policy changes, you get separation, not dramatic, not explosive. Systematic. So what happens next? That's the uncomfortable part for Trump, because once the other side starts building alternatives, your options narrow fast, and what's left? 3 bad options. Option 1, back down, but that requires a psychological shift Trump almost never makes. It requires admitting that pressure produced resistance, not obedience, that the show of force accelerated the very diversification it was supposed to prevent. Option 2, double down, hit harder, threaten more, escalate tariffs, expand the punishment, but that immediately raises costs for U.S. manufacturers, U.S. consumers, U.S. energy systems, U.S. defense inputs, and U.S. industrial supply chains already dependent on Canadian aluminum, nickel, uranium, and integrated cross-border production. CSIS estimated a 25% tariff on Canadian mineral imports could cost U.S. off-takers an additional $11.75 billion. That is not abstract, that is pain. Option 3, go extreme, unilateral measures, open coercion, system-breaking tactics, and that is the worst option of all, because it doesn't just damage trade. It breaks trust forever, and once trust breaks at the level of allies, the damage compounds quietly. Other countries start asking quiet questions. If Washington can do this to Canada, who's next? If the rules can be rewritten on impulse, what exactly is the value of dependence? If access can become coercion overnight, why keep building inside that system? And that's how influence fades, not all at once, not with a bang, with hesitation, with hedging, with partners who stop assuming you are stable. And once you understand all of that, the real lesson comes into focus. Trump is reacting. Canada is redesigning. That's the difference. One side is trying to force the old map back into existence. The other is drawing a new one. Power isn't just about what exists. It's about what people believe is stable, what investors believe is stable, what manufacturers believe is stable, what allies believe is stable, what young engineers, skilled workers, exporters, and consumers believe is stable. Because when a worker looks at the future, where do they place their bet? On the country still threatening everybody inside an aging model? Or on the country building new corridors, new partnerships, new markets, and new contingencies? When a consumer looks at the future, where do they place their trust? On noise or on structure? When a young person looks at the next 20 years, where do they place their ambition? On coercion or on adaptation? Let that sink in. This is not some clean fairy tale. Canada is not magically free of U.S. dependence. The U.S. is still enormous. Geography still matters. Supply chains still matter. Pain is still real. Reuters explicitly noted the limits of diversification. But that's what makes this story more powerful, not less, because the important shift is not total independence overnight. It's the beginning of strategic irreversibility, and that is why Trump's trade war may end up being remembered not as the moment Canada folded, but as the moment Canada decided it would never be cornered the same way again. This isn't just about Trump and Canada, it's about a turning point, a moment, where one side chose to adapt, and the other tried to force the world to adapt to it, and history is very clear about how those moments end. The side that builds the future wins.